Right, so at the risk of distracting from where focus should be, which is the ongoing plight of Palestinians, it's still important to challenge the ongoing pro-Israeli narratives, and we're seeing that in no small part in the US on college campuses right now. Students saying enough is enough and being referred to as antisemitic mobs, taking over, in the words of Israel's genocidal maniac of a Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, because they wish their colleges to divest themselves of financial interests in Israel, to disassociate themselves from the Zionist regime, very much a not in our names moment. Because college administrations have kicked back over this, the movement has spread across multiple colleges and universities. Young people in America are not backing down, so where will that end? Well, for as much as what is happening in the US is gaining a lot of media attention and a lot of traction right now, where this ends is demonstrated over here in an appallingly underreported story that has actually been rumbling along for years now. The sacking of a democratically elected union body president for holding anti-Zionist beliefs, and the cost of which to her former administration for siding with Israel, which has now passed the £1 million mark. Right, so let's start with what has been going on in the US here, on US campuses, which began at Columbia University in New York, but because of what has happened there, the reaction they've got to their protest, the movement has spread. Such has been the horrified and appalled reactions by other students in the US and across the world, actually, as is beginning to take hold also. This began at Columbia University, as I said, where the students have been protesting the administration there. The New York Times put out an article reading, "College protesters make divestment from Israel a rallying cry," using the chant, "Disclose, divest, we will not stop, we will not rest," demanding the school administrators do just that. The D from BDS, that phrase we're pretty familiar with already over here, possibly the least understood word amongst boycott, divestment and sanctions, though. To divest is simply the opposite of invest. So pull all financial interests they might have in the state of Israel out. This spread from Columbia to Yale, Harvard, University of Southern California, Cornell, and more besides. It's a growing movement across the United States, though the divestment demands might vary slightly, as this excerpt from the New York Times shows. What it actually means has varied in scope and level of detail. At Yale and Cornell, students have called on the universities to stop investing in weapons manufacturers. Columbia students are demanding the sale of holdings in funds and businesses that activists say are profiting from Israel's invasion of Gaza and the longer-term occupation of Palestinian lands, including Google, which has a large contract with the Israeli government, and Airbnb, which allows listings in Israeli settlements on the occupied West Bank. Now, the counter-argument being presented is that the effect of divestment from schools, colleges and universities, well, it would be negligible. It wouldn't do anything. It would have no effect. But that isn't the point, is it? It is students and teachers, it has to be said as well, exercising their right to take a stand against the genocide they see happening in whatever small way they're capable of doing, that their government refuses to stop funding. And of course, as this story becomes bigger and bigger, it becomes more a source of national embarrassment. When those in charge are so ardently pro-Israel, from government level down to school administration level, they haven't helped themselves in how they've reacted, from arrests to barring students from entering campus, because peaceful protest just isn't acceptable to them. Footage across social media has shown significant police aggression. It's just students, remember. Yet all the time you have to also remember what the so-called law are actually standing to protect here. Israel being allowed to commit genocide and the state protecting that and clamping down on anybody speaking out against it. At Columbia, students were allegedly attacked with the Israeli chemical skunk that the IDF use against protesters and Palestinians, allegedly delivered by two former IDF soldiers at that, so the story goes. And repeatedly, this stuff smells worse than raw sewage, so that's grim. But more grim was Netanyahu, seemingly belying how insignificant an impact these actions might have, putting out a video himself, a sickening video, calling these protesters an anti-Semitic mob, conflating hatred of Jews with legitimate criticism of the Israeli state. As per usual, nothing new there. But he actually went so far as to compare what is happening in America to what happened in 1930s Germany, because he is the sort of person to absolutely do that. The genocidalist once more playing the victim and expecting to be believed, but he won't be by those protesting. His arrogance will harden resolve, I hope, and a great many anti-Zionist Jews around the world are expressing their solidarity with the students there, because there is absolutely nothing anti-Semitic in what they are doing, standing up for the oppressed and against the oppressors and their own government's involvement in that. But where does this ultimately end, or where can it end? What's one possible ending for this? Well, we have insight for that. For an insight into how things can pan out further down the line, it's worth looking at an ongoing story that has had far, far less coverage than this US story is having, and actually takes place here in the UK. And this is the story of the sacking of the elected president of the National Union of Students. So this is directly relatable to what is happening in the US as well. And this is the sacking of Shema Delali. Shema Delali was elected to the full-time employed position of president of the NUS in March of 2022. She's always held staunch pro-Palestinian beliefs. She has been outspoken in her condemnation of anti-Semitism as well. However, she is also avowedly anti-Zionist, which of course, as we know, is not anti-Semitic in and of itself. Or at least we should know that by now. As much as the state of Israel would like state criticism to be considered racist, it isn't. But that hasn't stopped those who think that way or would seek to use that as a weapon from seeking to bring her down for her views, even though they are protected under the Equalities Act of 2010. Following her election, the complaints began. Personal abuse and threats as well, all amounting to conflating her legitimate views with being racist. But also, in what strikes me as remarkably Islamophobic, complaints relating to her association with Muslims and Muslim human rights organisations were made as well. Some truly charming people. Choosing to act on these complaints, the NUS undertook what became a farce of an investigation, seemingly designed to ensure her dismissal, as has been reported. Allegations that have been reported include complainants being allowed to decide who would investigate and the terms of the investigation against Shema Delali herself. Yet she wasn't allowed that. She wasn't allowed legal representation either. Written submissions from her were refused to be admitted as evidence in her case, and the complaints were publicised as well. She finally learned that she'd been dismissed from her role as president in the November of 2022 and found out via Twitter. It was the first day of Islamophobia Awareness Month at that, and if I haven't mentioned it already, Delali is herself Muslim. Well, she hasn't accepted it, and in March of 2023 she commenced employment tribunal proceedings against the NUS for unfair dismissal. And she had much in the way of well wishes and support already ahead of this move, from the likes of the Muslim Council of Britain, the Muslim Association of Britain, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and FOSIS, the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, who represent Muslim students. Part of the statement issued by the Muslim Association of Britain I've picked out, and it reads, "This is the first time in the history of the NUS's existence that a democratically elected president, who also happens to be a Muslim, black, hijabi woman, has been removed from their position. There is no doubt that this is an act of Islamophobia that sends a clear message to Muslim students that they are not welcome in the NUS. The NUS is allowing a hostile environment which demonises, marginalises and exposes Muslim students and those engaged in pro-Palestinian activism to Islamophobic attacks." Absolutely true in my view, fully agree with that. This is very much the hierarchy of racism playing out before our eyes, isn't it? Surely. So where do things stand now? Well, the case is still ongoing and the costs are adding up. The NUS have accepted that Delali's anti-Zionist beliefs actually are protected under the Equalities Act, but they haven't relented, they haven't backed down, and they haven't settled this matter. According to the Times, rare praise for actually covering something relevant for once there, their coverage showed that the investigation in 2022 has cost the NUS £622,500, and legal costs for 2023 amounted to another £222,500. Therefore, to date, it seems entirely plausible, especially since none of these costs factor in the legal fees covering Delali's defamation claim, that the NUS has already shelled out over £1 million in fighting this. The cost of Zionism, it would seem. 6 years ago, the NUS nearly went bankrupt, so how could they sustain this? Well, there's a spokesman's quote at the end of the Times article that said the union had committed significant time, money and resource to tackling anti-Semitism in the NUS and across the student movement. We will do whatever it takes to achieve this. Well, including going bust? For what? £1 million that could and should have been spent on students has instead been wasted fighting a battle instigated not by people fighting anti-Semitism, but weaponising it instead. And seemingly the NUS just simply cannot bring itself to save face and back down over this, despite knowing that Delali's views are protected characteristics now. Criticism of Zionism isn't racist. It is a protected characteristic in law. in employment law. It is our right to be appalled at what the Israeli regime says and does, and no matter how much they say otherwise, it doesn't make it true. And if the NUS lose their shirt fighting this, they'll only have themselves to blame. Meanwhile, of course, the weapons sales continue, not just in the US, but from the UK as well. David Cameron signing off on more arms sales just 2 days after the deaths of the World Central Kitchen aid workers, no less. 3 of whom, of course, were British, thus giving the impression Cameron values those sales, well, the Tories anyway, value those sales more than any of these Tories do about British lives. Find out more about that shocker of a story in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.